In the winter of 1852, my family and I were crossing the high plains of Wyoming, part of a wagon train bound for the Oregon Territory. We had left Fort Laramie in late October, when the cottonwoods still held their gold and the air smelled of sage and promise. My 2 oxen, Buck and Bright, had pulled our wagon faithfully for over 1,000 miles, from Independence, Missouri, through the endless prairie, across the Platte River ford, over the rolling sandhills. Their broad shoulders and steady pace were all that stood between us and the wilderness. I had bought them from a farmer in Kentucky before we even thought of heading west. Buck was the older one, dark red with a white face, patient and strong. Bright was younger, lighter in color with a stubborn streak but loyal to the bone. They had become more than livestock to me. They were companions, partners in this great journey. My wife Sarah rode beside me on the wagon seat, her hands raw from holding the reins during my rest. Our daughter Emily, just 7 years old, nestled in blankets behind us, reading from her mother's Bible, practicing her letters. Our son, Thomas, barely 2, slept most days in a cradle wedged between barrels of cornmeal and salt pork. We had left behind everything we knew. Sarah's family farm in Ohio, my work as a blacksmith, the graves of our parents, all for the promise of free land and a new life in Oregon. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Holloway, had made this journey 3 times before. His face was weathered like old leather, his eyes sharp and knowing. He knew every water hole, every dangerous crossing, every place where the tribes might be watching. We trusted him with our lives and the lives of 17 other families traveling in our train. The November sky had been clear when we started that morning, crystalline blue stretching forever, the kind of sky that makes you believe anything is possible. Sarah hummed an old hymn. Emily played with her corn husk doll. Even Buck and Bright seemed eager, their pace quick and sure. But by midday, dark clouds rolled in from the north. First, just a thin line on the horizon, then growing, spreading like spilled ink across the sky. The temperature dropped so fast I could feel it through my coat. Holloway rode down the line of wagons, his face grim. "We need to make camp," he called out. "Get the wagons circled. Double stake everything. This one's going to be bad." But a man named Kershaw, driving the wagon behind us, argued that we should push on. We were so close to South Pass, just 2 more days of travel, and we'd be through the worst of it. On the other side, the land dropped down into valleys where winter came later, where there was timber for shelter. Holloway shook his head. "I've seen men die for 2 days," he said. "We make camp." But Kershaw wasn't alone in his thinking. Half the families wanted to push forward. The debate grew heated, voices rising against the wind. In the end, Holloway gave in, against his better judgment. "We'll try for Willow Springs," he said. "But if this storm hits before we get there, don't say I didn't warn you." We pushed on. The wind began to rise. At first, just a breeze, then stronger, colder, carrying the smell of snow. By nightfall, the first flakes began to fall, soft and silent at first, drifting down like feathers. Emily caught them on her tongue, delighted. But within an hour, the snow came harder, driving sideways in sheets of white. The temperature dropped so fast that the water in our barrels turned to slush. The wind tore at the canvas wagon covers like something alive and hungry, trying to rip them from their frames. We never made it to Willow Springs. Holloway called a halt wherever we were, and we circled the wagons as best we could in the howling darkness. Men shouted to each other, barely heard over the wind. We unhitched Buck and Bright, tied them close to the wagon where they'd have some shelter from the wind. I gave them the last of our grain, rubbed their necks, thanked them for the day's work. That night, huddled inside our wagon listening to the storm rage, I thought about turning back, but there was nothing behind us now, only 1,000 miles of empty prairie and the bones of those who hadn't made it this far. Sarah held Thomas close, nursing him while Emily slept fitfully between us. The wagon shook and creaked. Snow found its way through every gap in the canvas, settling in small drifts along the floorboards. When dawn came, pale and gray, the storm had not lessened. If anything, it had grown worse. The wind screamed across the plains. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. The cold was unlike anything I had known. It burned the lungs, froze the breath in your beard, turned your fingers numb in seconds. I climbed out to check on Buck and Bright. The snow was already knee-deep, drifting against the wagons. The oxen stood with their backs to the wind, heads lowered, frost thick on their hides, but they were alive. I brushed the snow from their backs, checked their legs for ice, gave them what little hay we had left. Buck turned his head to look at me, his dark eyes patient, trusting. "I'll get you through this, boy," I said. "I promise." But that night, Buck began to cough, a wet, rattling sound that I had heard before in livestock caught out in cold. It meant fluid in the lungs, pneumonia. There was nothing to be done, no shelter to move them to, no medicine to give. By morning, his eyes were clouded. His breath came in short gasps. Bright stood beside him, head low, not eating, as if in mourning. I did what I could, wrapped them in every blanket we could spare, even our own. Sarah and I shivering in the wagon, trying to keep Emily and Thomas warm. But the cold was merciless. It took everything. By noon of the second day, Buck collapsed in the snow, his legs folded beneath him. I knelt beside him, my hands on his frost-covered hide, feeling his heart beat slow and slower. Bright lowered his head, touching his nose to Buck's face, making a low sound deep in his chest. Then Buck's breathing stopped. I stayed there in the snow until I couldn't feel my hands anymore. Bright followed an hour later. He simply laid down beside Buck and closed his eyes, as if he had decided he wouldn't go on without his partner. I wept then, not just for the oxen, but for everything, for the impossibility of our situation, for the foolishness of pushing on when Holloway had warned us, for the fear in Sarah's eyes and Emily's quiet questions about whether we would die. Holloway rode up on his horse, the only man who still had a mount. Everyone else had eaten their horses weeks ago. His face was grim. "Son," he said, "you'll have to leave the wagon. Take what you can carry. We're going to try to walk out. Head south until we hit the Sweetwater River. Follow it down." But everything we owned was in that wagon. Our tools, our seed corn, the deed to the land waiting for us in Oregon. Sarah's mother's Bible, the only thing she had left of her family. Emily's few toys, Thomas's cradle that I had carved with my own hands. I looked at Holloway. "You go on," I said. "We'll catch up." He shook his head slowly. "Son, you won't make it on foot. Not with the little ones. Not in this." Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small bag. "There's some dried meat," he said, "and a little tobacco." He pressed it into my hands. "I'm sorry." Then he rode away, calling for the others to gather what they could carry. Within an hour, the wagon train was moving, dark shapes in the white, growing smaller, fainter. Then they were gone, and we were alone. Sarah didn't speak. She just held Thomas, rocking him gently. Emily looked at me with wide eyes. "Papa, are we going to die?" "No, sweetheart," I said. "We're going to be fine." But I didn't believe it. We huddled inside our wagon that first night, burning everything we could spare for warmth. Chair legs, an old trunk, the wooden tool handles. Emily's fever started just after midnight, her forehead hot to the touch, her skin dry. Sarah held her close, singing softly the old hymns from her childhood, while I kept the fire going, feeding it piece by piece, watching our possessions turn to ash and heat. By dawn, the storm had not lessened. If anything, it had worsened. The wind howled like wolves, like the damned. Snow piled against the wagon wheels, halfway up the spokes, then higher. I knew we were going to die there, buried in our wagon, frozen in the place we had staked everything to reach. We had maybe 2 days of firewood left. Then the cold would take us, just like it took Buck and Bright. On the second night after the wagon train left, I stepped outside to check the animals. Even though they were dead, I needed to make sure snow wasn't drifting over them. That seemed important somehow, to not let them be buried, forgotten. But when I reached the place where they had fallen, the bodies were gone. Just 2 deep impressions in the snow, rapidly filling. My heart hammered in my chest. I thought maybe wolves had found them, dragged them off. But there were no tracks, no blood trail, no signs of disturbance. Nothing. The snow around the impressions was smooth, undisturbed, as if they had simply vanished. Then I heard it, the creak of leather, the jingle of trace chains, sounds I had heard every day for 1,000 miles. I turned back toward the wagon, and there in the swirling snow stood Buck and Bright, yoked and ready, just as they had been every morning of our journey. Their eyes glowed pale blue in the darkness, like ice lit from within. Frost covered their hides like silver fur, thick and glittering. Their breath came out in clouds, but their bodies were still and stiff, the way only the dead can be. They didn't move like living things. Their legs were too straight, their heads too still. But they were there, waiting. I should have been terrified, should have run, screamed, prayed. But all I felt was a strange calm, a deep knowing that they had come back for us. I walked to the wagon, my boots crunching in the snow. Sarah appeared at the canvas opening, her face white as the snow around us, Thomas crying in her arms, Emily peering around her mother's skirt. "Did you see?" I whispered. "I saw," she said. "Mama, are they angels?" Emily asked. Sarah's voice was steady. "I don't know, baby. But they're here to help us." We didn't speak after that. There were no words for what we were seeing. We simply climbed aboard. I took the reins in my shaking hands. The leather was ice cold, burned my palms, but I held on. With a soft click of my tongue, the same sound I had made 1,000 times before, Buck and Bright began to pull. They moved through the snow as if it wasn't there. The wagon didn't lurch or struggle, didn't sink into the drifts. It glided, smooth and silent, through snow that should have buried us, through drifts 4 feet deep that would have stopped any living team. All night they pulled, heading west, always west. I could see the faint outline of the trail, even though it was buried. The oxen never wavered, never slowed, never stopped, never turned their heads, never made a sound, just pulled, steady and sure, as they always had. Emily's fever broke just before dawn. She woke asking for water, her eyes clear. Sarah wept with relief, held her close. Thomas slept peacefully, the first real sleep in days. And I sat on that wagon seat, reins in my hands, watching the backs of 2 dead oxen pulling us toward salvation. When the sun finally rose, weak and pale through the thinning clouds, I saw something ahead. Dark shapes moving. The wagon train. They had made camp in a small valley with some protection from the wind. Buck and Bright pulled us right up to Holloway's wagon. He stared at us, his face going white, his mouth opening and closing. "How, in God's name?" he whispered. The others gathered around, silent, staring. We had been 4 days behind them through a storm that had killed 2 men in their train, through snow and cold that should have been impossible to cross. I climbed down from the seat, my legs shaking, barely able to stand. I walked to the front of the wagon to thank Buck and Bright, to touch their faces one last time, to tell them I would never forget. But when I reached the yoke, it was empty. Just leather straps hanging loose in the wind, swaying gently, and 2 sets of hoof prints in the snow, leading back the way we'd come. Clear and deep, fading as the sun climbed higher, melting into nothing. Holloway examined our wagon, walked around it slowly, touched the wheels, the tongue, noted the ice crusted on every surface, the frost thick as a man's thumb. "Son," he said quietly, his voice shaken, "nothing could have pulled this wagon through that storm. Nothing living." "But something did," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, something did. We reached Oregon that spring, built a farm in the Willamette Valley, rich soil, tall timber, a creek running clear and cold, everything we had dreamed of. Emily grew up strong and healthy, married a carpenter, had 5 children of her own. Thomas became a farmer, worked the land beside me until I was too old to hold the plow. Sarah and I grew old together, watching the seasons turn, watching our grandchildren play in fields we had planted. But I never bought another team of oxen. Couldn't bring myself to. I worked with horses after that, mules, anything but oxen. And sometimes, on winter nights when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls like it did on those high plains, I step outside into the cold and listen for the creak of leather, the jingle of chains, the soft, steady sound of hooves in snow, and I wonder if somewhere out there, on those endless plains, Buck and Bright are still pulling, still carrying lost souls through the darkness, still finding their way home, still keeping the promise that I made to them that cold morning when I said, "I'll get you through this," not knowing that they would be the ones to get us through. Sometimes Emily asks me, now that she's grown with silver in her hair, if I really believe what we saw that night, if it was real or just fever dreams and desperation. I tell her what I know. I know that we should have died. I know that something pulled our wagon through impossible cold, through snow that buried everything in its path. I know that Buck and Bright were the finest team a man could ask for, in life and in death. And I know that when my time comes and I close my eyes for the last time, I hope to see them again, waiting, patient as always, ready to pull me one more time toward home.